all of you. So first, a little personal announcement. Mr. Gates did finally ask me to marry him. I am officially engaged. And I miss all of you guys so much, and I wish I could see all of your lovely faces here in the classroom. But alas, I cannot. So I'm going to make this video of a lesson. I'm going to do that at the beginning of each week, a video of what you're going to do for the week and a lesson. So for this week, for ELA, I want you to stick with continuing to do your reading plus your 3 lessons and your 2 vocabulary. And I want 1 to 3 iReady lessons completed as well. And if you do not have internet, you will have some LEAP workbook pages to do out of your ELA LEAP book. But for social studies today, we're actually going to start talking about events that led up to the French and Indian War. Now, I know we've kind of discussed it already, how the French and the British they had these territories in North America, and they started claiming the same territories and started fighting, and eventually the fighting and the arguments led to them having an outright war. Today we're going to talk about how George Washington was a part of the French and Indian War starting. So I'm going to read through the sources with you and go over the questions. And along with this, it's going to be sent the questions that go with this, so you can answer them on loose leaf paper, and you'll take pictures of them and send them in for me to grade by the end of the week. Now, I'm going to go ahead and read the first part. It's titled George Washington, as you can see. At the beginning of the 1750s, a conflict had arisen between the French and the British in the Ohio Valley. Big surprise, French and British, they're always fighting. British colonists during this time continued to move westward from the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, while the French continued to move south from Canada. Each of these countries were conveying to the world and each other that they had claims and possession of the Ohio Valley. So the British kept moving westward and saying, hey, this is our land. But then the French kept moving south from Canada and saying, no, it's our land. So they were both saying it's our land, and they were fighting over it. At this time, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, who was acting as governor of Virginia at the time, had a financial interest in the Ohio River Valley because he owned part of the Ohio Company. So, he had a lot of money in this area that the French was also laying claim to. The Ohio Company had plans of settling and selling the Ohio Valley to British settlers, as they had recently purchased a large sum of land from the Iroquois. Remember, the Iroquois and the British got along because they were very warlike and they were very violent. And they had gained it from defeating other Native American tribes. Dinwiddie had caught wind that the French had moved into and created forts in the Ohio Valley. After gaining this information, Dinwiddie petitioned the House of Burgesses to fund a military expedition against the French in the Ohio Valley. The House of Burgesses denied Dinwiddie's request, and Dinwiddie decided to send an emissary instead. An emissary is someone who goes somewhere to try to figure things out and help. So Dinwiddie, this was the governor of Virginia, he wanted the Ohio Valley because it would make money for them. They could sell it to British settlers and make money off of it. But Dinwiddie found out, oh no, the French are moving into this land that I own, and that means I won't be able to make money off of it. So he tried to ask for, soldiers to fight the French off, but they said no. So Dinwiddie's like, okay, maybe I'll send someone to see if we can solve this without fighting instead. In 1753, George Washington, who was 21 years old at the time, this is a very young George Washington, presented himself to Dinwiddie and requested that he become a volunteer as a part of the British emissary to the French. Dinwiddie accepted the request and instructed him to go to the Ohio Valley and determine the locations of the French forts and fortresses. During his travels, he was to acquire a Native American escort, someone to show them around, and find each of the French forts in the Ohio Valley. Once Washington arrived at the forts, he was to hand the French a letter that requested they move themselves from the British territories in the Ohio Valley. So George Washington went to the governor Dinwiddie and was like, hey, can I go with you guys to help, get rid of the French? And Dinwiddie's like, yeah, sure. And he basically told George Washington, I need you to spy, all right? I need you to find out how many forts they have, how many soldiers they have, what's their supplies. We're not attacking them yet, but I want you to find out what they have. And he also gave George Washington a letter to give to the French people saying, hey, this is the British government, please get off our land. Because I guess they thought, hey, if we give them a letter telling them to get off our land, they will. I don't know about that, though. While traveling to the French forts, George Washington and his men were able to acquire a Native American escort, someone to help them go around, who also hunted fresh meat for the men. By December 1753, Washington had reached the first French fort. The fort had been owned originally by a British trader who had been expelled by the French. The French had taken the British man's buildings and began to fortify them. So they came to a fort that used to be a British fort. But when they got there, it was owned by the French. They had kicked out all the British people and they're like, this is our fort now. And so George Washington handed the letter to the commander of the fort. The letter tells them, hey, get out. The commander told Washington that he could not make this decision and that he had to go to the next fort, Fort Le Boeuf. While interacting with the French, Washington took note about the fort and how many forces were located there. So the first French fort he got to, he looked at how many men were there, what supplies they had, and he handed him the letter saying, hey, we need you to leave. Well, the French guy in charge at the fort was like, I don't know if I can, answer anything about this letter. You have to go to the next one. And so George Washington was like, all right. So he went to the next French fort, Fort Le Boeuf. Washington and his party then traveled to Fort Le Boeuf, where they met with the regional commander of the French forces. Washington again handed the letter to the commander. Not wanting to make a decision about the letter, the French commander told Washington he had to go present the letter to the governor of Canada, who was located in Quebec. Again, Washington observed the fort and the number of forces located there. While at Fort Le Boeuf, Washington's Native American escorts presented the French with a treaty belt. The French refused to accept the belt, and Washington was convinced that the French were planning on sending military forces down the river to claim British territories in the Ohio Valley. So he went to the next fort, gave the letter to the commander, and said, hey, we want you to leave. This is ours. This is British territory. And the French commander was like, I can't do anything about this. You're going to have to go to the French governor up in Canada, up in Quebec. I can't do anything about it. And Washington, once again, was spying and looking like how many soldiers they had, what kind of supplies. And then their Native American escort tried to make a treaty belt with the French. And the French were like, no. So Washington was like, oh no. I think they're actually planning to attack all of our other forts and take our territories in the Ohio Valley. So Washington was convinced the French were going to attack them. Coming to the assumption that the French were planning to attack the British, Washington decided to return to Dinwiddie as soon as possible and notify him of the French plans. While returning to Williamsburg, Virginia, Washington's Native American escort eventually left him as they took favor to the hospitality of the French. Washington also left his party along the trail while he and explorer Christopher Gist traveled overland so they could make better time and return to Dinwiddie as quick as they could. Upon arrival, Washington handed his papers and impressions of the French to Dinwiddie. So Washington decided, okay, I think the French are going to attack. I'm going to get back to the governor Dinwiddie as quick as possible and tell him what I think. And that's what he did. He actually left most of his men behind. Him and one other dude were basically running over the land, trying to get back to the governor as quick as possible. Like, oh no, the French are going to take all of our land in the Ohio Valley. All right. And as always, they have the questions first before the sources. I'm going to go over the sources first, and then I'll go over the questions with you guys. Okay. Okay. So when George Washington got back and was telling Dinwiddie what he saw and what he found, this was Dinwiddie's response. When Washington arrived back in Williamsburg, he reported directly to the Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie. Washington handed Dinwiddie his journal of his travels throughout the Ohio Valley and the French forts. After reading Washington's journal, Dinwiddie was convinced that the building of the French forts in the Ohio Valley was an act of aggression to the British colony and justified a military response. So Dinwiddie was like, oh, they're taking our forts and they're building forts? Oh, they're planning to attack us for sure. We definitely need military and soldiers to come in here and attack the French and move them out of the Ohio Valley. Washington, George Washington, very young, was promoted to lieutenant colonel and was ordered to recruit men for a mission against the French. At the same time, a trader named William Trent was set forth to find 100 men who would build a fort at the Forks as to defend the British from any further French advances. So Dinwiddie sent this guy to build a fort at a part in the Ohio Valley where there was a bunch of rivers to stop the French from coming any further into the Ohio Valley. Now, based on the sources, which we're going to go over, find evidence from each source that will support Dinwiddie's claim that the British colonies needed to send military forces to the Ohio Valley to protect British claims to the region. Also explain how the evidence supports Dinwiddie's claim. All this is saying, how do the sources show that Dinwiddie thinks the French are planning to attack? What about the sources would make you think the French are trying to attack us or take the British land? So we're going to go through the sources and then I'll explain what to do for the questions. Okay. Okay. So source one is actually a map, all right? It's just a map of the Ohio Valley and the rivers. And right here would be the forks that they sent that one guy to build a fort to stop the French from coming any further. Because right here would be a good location. It's like right kind of in the middle of everything. And he sent him here to build a fort. Because the French were all up here building the forts or taking over British forts. Now, source two is from George Washington's journal to the Ohio, because he kept notes of everything, all right? So his source two, this is what he was writing. He informed me that they, the French, had built two forts, one on Lake Erie and another on French Creek near a small lake about 15 miles apart, and a large wagon road between. They are both built after the same model, but different in size. That on the lake, the largest, he gave me a plan of them of his own drawing. So in this source, George Washington is describing the French are building these large forts close to each other along the rivers. So if I was George Washington and I'm supposed to be British territory and the French are building these forts close together, I would be thinking, okay, they're building all these forts so they can have supplies and soldiers, and they're close together so they can help each other. I'd kind of be thinking they're building all this stuff to fight against us, and that's probably what George Washington and Dinwiddie was thinking. Source three, which is another part of George Washington's journal. This is what he wrote. I could get no certain account of the number of men here, but according to the best judgment I could form, there are 100 exclusive of officers, of which there are many. I also gave orders to the people that were with me to take an exact account of the canoes that were hauled up to move the forces down the spring, which they did. And I also told them there were 50 canoes made of witch bark and 170 of pine. Besides these canoes, there were many others that were carved out in readiness to be made. So here Washington is saying, okay, in these forts, they have a whole bunch of men and officers. That means people who command military forces. And he also found they had a whole bunch of canoes made. You know, you only need a few canoes if you're planning on fishing or trapping beavers, for fur trade. But if you have a whole bunch of canoes, it's like you're planning on moving a whole bunch of men to go attack people, which is probably what George Washington and Dinwiddie were thinking. Like, oh my goodness, they're preparing to attack us. Source 4, also an excerpt from George Washington's journal. The French are now coming from the forts on Lake Erie and the creek to Vinegar to erect another fort from thence they designed to the forks of the Monongahela and to Logstown, and so to continue down the river building at the most convenient places in order to prevent our settlements a little below Chenopin's town. So here George Washington is saying they keep building further and further and further south. They're coming into our territory and they keep coming. I think they're trying to take over. So what you're going to do with these sources, back up to the questions. Now remember, in our questions, you use the RAP method, R-A-P. R, restate the question. A, answer the question. And P, prove your answer. You guys cite it, like based on source 1 or based on source 2. Or I read this in source 1 and source 2. Something to me that proves it, restate it, and answer it. All right? Okay, the first question, describe why George Washington was sent to the Ohio Valley. Go back to the reading, or you can rewind this video to where I read it. Why was George Washington sent to the Ohio Valley in the first place? All right? Then what you're going to do for the next 4 questions, it asks you based on the sources, so the 4 sources I read, find evidence from each source that would support Dinwiddie's claim that the British colonists needed to send military forces to the Ohio Valley to protect British claims to the region. So what about the sources would make Dinwiddie want to say, I need soldiers, I need the military to fight the French? What about the sources would make him think that? So, yet again, using your RAP method, okay? So source 1, you would do your evidence. The evidence from source 1 that would support Dinwiddie's claim would be da-da-da-da-da. I know this because da-da-da-da-da. And then just your explanation. Tell me the evidence from the source and explain how it's evidence of Dinwiddie wanting to attack the French. And you're going to do the same for every source. Source 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I know you know how to do this. You've done this all year long in my classroom. You are all excellent. You're all smart, and I miss you guys. And next week, I will be making another video for our next lesson. And I love you guys, and I hope to hear from you soon.